drawing some who've never protested before.
One quiet corridor, one young woman, 23 stab wounds. In a budget hotel in the West Midlands, a routine night shift became the moment the country could no longer look away. 27-year-old Rian Sky White, working reception for minimum wage, was found on the floor behind the desk. The suspect, a man from Sudan staying under a government asylum placement, had walked past staff and guests all day without raising a hint of concern. Nothing felt unusual until everything did. Outside, smoke slid up the hotel's façade as emergency lights washed the brickwork. Across the road, her colleague, Khloe Bennett, lifted her phone with shaking hands. She managed only one sentence. She was just doing her job. Why did she have to be the one who died? By midnight, that line had been watched more than 3 million times. And the hotel, where no one ever expected national attention, became the place where a single tragedy demanded answers far beyond its walls.
Back away now! Back away! Back away! Move back!
The attack inside the Red Bridge Inn. The Red Bridge Inn was not designed to carry the weight of this moment. It was a 2-storey roadside hotel built in the early 1980s, the kind of place delivery drivers and travelling workers used to book when they needed a cheap bed and a hot shower. In recent years, it had been converted into migrant accommodation under an emergency contract with the government. The lobby had been repainted, the signage updated. The website quietly mentioned longer-term residents but did not explain what that really meant. For people like Ryan, it was simply a place of work. She checked in guests, answered phones, folded linen, and tried to stretch wages that barely covered rent. On the night of the killing, the suspect had walked past the reception desk just after 9 o'clock, appearing, according to witnesses, calm and unremarkable. Moments later, in the service corridor behind the desk, everything changed. The weapon was not a gun or a knife, but a screwdriver taken from a maintenance room. The violence was frenzied and intimate, packed into a space barely wide enough for 2 people to walk through at the same time. By the time another staff member reached the corridor, the suspect was gone, and Ryan was bleeding on the tiles. Paramedics arrived quickly, but some things move faster than medical teams. News travels faster, anger travels faster, fear travels fastest of all. As uniformed officers began sealing off the area with tape, the story was already leaving the building. Staff sent messages to friends, guests called relatives. Khloe's live video spread from phone to phone. Inside that hotel corridor, one life had been taken. Outside its walls, something else was detonating. From shock to a crowd. Within an hour of the attack, the street outside the Red Bridge Inn shifted from an ordinary road into the first gathering point. At first, it was a few neighbours who had seen the lights and heard the sirens standing in dressing gowns and hurriedly pulled on coats. Then a small group of Ryan's friends arrived, some clutching flowers they had picked up from an all-night petrol station. They clustered together, trying to make sense of the fact that a woman they had spoken to only hours earlier was now gone. The air was cold, their breath visible as they talked about her laugh, her patience with difficult guests, the way she sent messages asking whether people had got home safely. Then cars began to pull up from farther away. People from Dudley, Wolverhampton and Birmingham stepped out onto the pavement, drawn not only by geography but by the feeling that something much larger than one local tragedy was underway. Many of them did not know Ryan personally. They knew something else instead. The endless news stories about migrant hotels, the repeated assurances from officials that all necessary checks were in place, the constant sense that decisions were being made about their towns without anyone asking them what it felt like to live there. Handmade signs appeared as the evening went on. Some were scrawled quickly on cardboard, others carefully lettered in black marker. They did not sound like party slogans, they sounded like accusations. She worked, you gambled. Security is not paperwork, it is people. If this was your daughter, would this be acceptable? The more those words appeared in camera frames, the more people watching online started to feel that this was not someone else's town. This was everyone's warning.
Tensions ran high in the streets of Liverpool between anti-immigrant UK independent protesters and activists from the British organisation Stand Up to Racism. There was a large police presence, but they couldn't prevent the two from clashing.
One town becomes a signal. By early morning, Walsall was no longer just a dot on a map. It was trending at the top of every major platform. Clips of the burning side entrance and screaming sirens were cut together with screenshots from Rian's social media profiles, still images of her smiling at work or posing with friends. Some edits were careful, others were brutal. There were people who focused only on the suspect's immigration status, turning the tragedy into fuel for their argument that the country had lost control of its borders. There were others who focused only on the failure of official oversight, pointing at the contracts that had turned hotels into emergency hostels, accusing the state of warehousing human beings and abandoning staff. Across the sea in Belfast, footage from Walsall appeared on phones, in pubs, living rooms and bus stops. Within hours, a crowd had formed outside migrant accommodation on the edges of the city. In Leeds, a protest that began with a few dozen people outside another hotel doubled, then doubled again. In London, people moved toward Westminster Bridge and nearby buildings where asylum decisions are signed and sent. No one organisation appeared to be in control, but the same rhythm beat beneath every gathering. A local place, a human loss, a shared sense of betrayal. The phrase that had started on Park Street in Walsall began to echo in city squares hundreds of miles away. She died in silence. We will not. It was shouted into the air, written on placards, typed into comment sections. The more it spread, the less this looked like a single town in crisis. It began to look like something the entire country would have to answer.
The unrest comes after a stabbing in Southport that killed 3 young girls on Monday. False information about the suspect's background quickly spread online.
If you've ever worked a late shift, trusting the world to be safe around you, this story hits differently. Rian was just doing what so many of us do every day, showing up, hoping the system has our back. Who do you believe should answer for what went wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments, tap like so her story isn't forgotten, and subscribe if you want to follow what actually changes after this. The hotel as a symbol for everyone. By midday, the Red Bridge Inn was no longer just a building. It had become a symbol that meant very different things depending on where you stood. For many of the protesters, it was proof that their communities had been treated as laboratories for policies designed far away. They saw the hotel as evidence that the government had decided certain postcodes could be used as containers, packing in desperate people without proper support, without sufficient security, and without honest consultation with those already living nearby. For them, the Red Bridge Inn represented a broken promise that ordinary workers would be kept safe while the country tried to do the right thing for those fleeing war and persecution.
Masking the anger.
Who've gathered outside asylum hotels all summer.
They're calling you Nazi scum.
I couldn't care less what they call me.
For the migrants still inside the hotel, the symbol looked very different. They peered through curtains at crowds chanting outside, watching police lines stand between them and people who might blame them for a crime they had not committed. Many had already lived through violence in other countries, now listening as the anger of a new country rose around their temporary rooms. To them, the Red Bridge Inn did not feel like a political failure. It felt like a trap. Between these perspectives stood the staff, or what was left of them. The cleaning teams, reception workers and security guards who had been told that risk assessments had been carried out and that the building was safe enough to live and work in now found themselves wondering how much of that had ever really been true. Each time a news channel described the hotel as secure accommodation, the phrase cut a little deeper. They knew exactly how much protection there had been in that corridor. Not enough to save a single life. Police on the edge of control.
Send them back! 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 Send them back!
The officers tasked with managing the protests walked a tightrope that day. Many had families of their own, relatives working in low-paid jobs, partners doing late shifts in care homes and hospitals. Some had served in the armed forces. Some had relatives who had come to the country as refugees. They were not facing a single uniform crowd. They were standing in front of a mixture of grief, fury, fear and opportunism. The initial approach was intentionally soft. Officers wore standard uniforms, no heavy riot gear on display, no batons raised. They spoke to stewards where possible, redirected traffic and tried to keep the mood from turning into something more explosive. But as the hours passed and more people arrived, the temperature in the crowd began to rise. There were moments when someone pushed forward too hard, when a bottle flew, when an angry shout turned into a brief scuffle. Police adjusted, pulling on helmets, raising shields, forming tighter lines around hotel entrances and side doors. Inside control rooms, commanders watched live footage on screens divided into dozens of squares, each showing a different town or city dealing with the same story. The messages being passed between them were simple and repetitive. Units stretched, reinforcements delayed. Do not let the crowds reach the hotel lobbies. The instruction was not to stamp out protest. It was to prevent a second tragedy. Frightened residents dragged from rooms or staff attacked while trying to leave their shifts. At street level, though, the distinction was not always clear. People saw a wall of shields and read it as opposition, not protection. Each minute that passed increased the chance that one bad decision might trigger an entire night of violence. The government's careful distance.
In many cities, anti-racism campaigners mounted counter-demonstrations.
Please protect the fascists!
And the police had to step in to keep the opposing groups separated.
When the government finally responded, its words felt as if they had been written in a different country. A spokesperson stepped in front of a lectern in London and delivered a familiar arrangement of phrases. There was deep sadness at the loss of life. There was a promise of a full review of security at migrant accommodation sites. There was a statement of continued commitment to a fair and compassionate asylum system. There was praise for the emergency services and a request that the public remain calm while the investigation continued. On paper, the response ticked every expected box. In practice, it missed the point. People outside hotels did not want more committees. They did not want another internal report that would circulate in quiet corridors months later. They wanted someone in power to say plainly that the balance between risk and responsibility had been lost. They wanted to hear the words, "We failed," directed not at one isolated worker, but at an entire category of people who had been told to trust a system that clearly did not earn that trust. In the absence of that acknowledgement, the gap between those inside government buildings and those outside hotel doors widened further. The convoy of dark cars moving away from Westminster that evening, windows tinted, police motorcycles clearing the way, became an image in itself. Edited side by side with shots of shivering protesters holding candles, it told a story that no official briefing could undo. The online battle for reality. While crowds swelled in the streets, another fight was underway on screens. Some accounts posted genuine eyewitness testimony and careful details. Others manipulated clips to fit their preferred narrative. A video of a small group of protesters throwing objects was shared with captions claiming that asylum seekers had launched an attack, even though the people in the footage were actually local residents. Another clip showed police pushing back a line of demonstrators who were trying to move closer to the hotel doors. Depending on who posted it, this was either evidence of the state crushing legitimate anger or proof that officers were heroically holding the line to prevent an assault on vulnerable residents.
They're really close to tipping point, this country. So many of us are struggling to pay for everything.
Within this confusion, one thing remained clear. The original core of the story, a young woman stabbed to death while doing her job, did not change. For many people, the complexity of the wider debate only reinforced their sense that those in charge were better at arguing online than protecting lives on the ground. Each new claim and counterclaim added noise, but not comfort. Anger, but at whom? As microphones moved through the crowds, a pattern began to emerge. Yes, there were some voices blaming all migrants for the actions of one man. They spoke in absolutes, claimed that doors should have been closed long ago, insisted that this tragedy proved what they had always believed. But when you listened more widely, the fury was aimed upward at least as often as it was aimed sideways. A father in Wolverhampton said he did not want to see anyone dragged out of a hotel, but that he was sick of hearing that everything was under control when clearly it was not. A nurse in Birmingham held a placard that read, "Protect everyone properly or stop pretending you can." Khloe, still processing the loss of her friend, put it most simply in another brief message recorded from the edge of the crowd. She said, "I am not asking you to abandon people who need refuge. I am asking why the people you pay to keep those places running are the ones left unprotected." That distinction mattered to many watching. This was not a neat divide between those who support migration and those who oppose it. It was something messier, angrier and harder to dismiss. A sense that the state could move quickly when signing contracts but dragged its feet when safeguarding the people working under those contracts. The ledger of a nation. In the days that followed, commentators kept returning to the same idea, that the events around the Red Bridge Inn had opened a ledger the country had been avoiding. On one side of that ledger sat the numbers that governments like to publish. The total spent on emergency accommodation, the figure for asylum decisions completed, the count of hotel beds converted to temporary shelter. On the other side sat things that cannot be tallied so easily. The fear experienced by a night worker walking down a corridor alone. The anxiety of residents wondering whether they are safe in their rooms. The brittle trust of neighbours who feel policies are implemented in their streets with no regard for their input when 150,000 people surround hotels and government buildings in a single day, holding up photographs and flowers and hand-painted signs. They are not presenting a spreadsheet. They are presenting a bill. It is a demand for someone somewhere to stop hiding behind statistics and address the simple question underneath. Who is actually being protected by the current arrangement and who is being asked to carry the risk quietly? Ashes, flowers and what remains. As the immediate protests eased, a different kind of scene emerged. Volunteers stayed behind to clear rubbish from streets, carry away broken glass and scrub soot from nearby walls. Local churches opened their doors for anyone who needed to sit in silence for a while, whether they were lifelong residents, recent arrivals, police officers coming off long shifts, or staff from the hotel overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Candles were lit on small side tables with handwritten notes inviting people to pray, to think or simply to breathe. At the rear entrance of the Red Bridge Inn, where Rian had walked out countless times between shifts, a small memorial grew each day. Bouquets wrapped in crinkled plastic leaned against the brickwork. Messages written on scrap paper and greeting cards spoke of gratitude for her kindness, apologies that she had not been kept safe, and promises that her name would not be forgotten. Someone had spray painted a sentence on the nearby wall that began to appear in photographs and posts across the country. Compassion is the last line of defence. For once, the words did not feel like a slogan. They felt like a warning. What kind of country comes next? This night was never just about one hotel or one crime. It exposed something deeper. A country that talks about protection, yet too often fails the people who depend on it most. While leaders speak under bright lights, ordinary workers stand alone on late shifts, hoping the system that promised to guard them actually will. Now the question is yours. When you look at what happened, who failed first and why? Drop your thoughts in the comments so your voice becomes part of this story. If you believe this should not fade into the noise, tap like so it stays visible, and subscribe if you want to follow what comes next, because the real consequences of this night are only just beginning.